about the it's about the travel that it enables. Transit is about movement. It's about the movement for people who are on the system, and it's also about the options it provides and the benefits it provides to people that aren't relying on transit, but still can take advantage of it when they need it, that have roadways that have less congestion because transit exists. So all of those things are important. As I said, it's also really important for our regional economy. It allows people to access jobs. It allows employers to have access to a wider talent pool. And especially important to this crowd, we know that transit is a really critical part of our region's response to climate change, that transit is important about reducing carbon emissions. It's important as we think about a more resilient transportation system, and that transit makes land use possible that is more environmentally sustainable. And so there is this complicated nexus of all of these things that transit is important, for and on behalf of. And it's really why we are thinking about its importance as we move forward through our current work. Just to highlight a couple of things specifically, we know that transit reduces carbon emissions. We have some stats here from the American Public Transportation Association showing, transit's estimated to reduce CO2 emissions by 37 million metric tons annually. We also know that transportation is a really important part of the overall greenhouse gas profile of the country and our region. Private vehicles are the largest contributor to a household's carbon footprint, and transit is one of the most important ways that people can shift that aspect of their emissions. On a daily basis, transit use saves 11 million gallons of gas. And transit is not just about households, moving from driving all the time to only using transit. That there's also an important way in which transit, by providing more options and allowing households to maybe take one car out of their rotation, can reduce emissions. Eliminating one car, we know, can reduce emissions by as much as 30%. But all of that is, sort of general stats about transit, and we are here today. As you probably know, things have changed over the last few years, and so I'm talking to you and going a little bit out of order here, but the Illinois General Assembly has required CMAP to come up with recommendations for what to do about the transit system through a process that we've called the Plan of Action for Regional Transit, which is, we'll get into the recommendations, but this is all, coming in response to things that have changed and adjusted over the last few years of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most visible ways in which the system has changed is that there are just fewer people riding it. So this chart shows what we know today about how transit ridership has changed over the course of the pandemic. Obviously, it fell quite dramatically in the beginning days of COVID-19 on the left side of this chart. And it has since regrown, but it has not regrown to where it was. And so, as of, I think this data is as of last month, the entire transit system is down about 45% from pre-COVID levels. Some aspects of the system, especially the region's bus services, CTA and PACE, have maintained more of their riders and have recovered to a greater degree. But on the whole, our transit system has fewer people who are using it on an average day than before COVID. And that has led to some challenges, a variety of challenges, operational and financial. I want to highlight some of the financial challenges. As you may know, the federal government stepped in to provide really significant funding to regional transit providers here in Northeastern Illinois, but also across the US. We have really robust injection of federal dollars that are supporting transit services throughout the country. And today, that looks like about 20% of the operating budget. Before COVID-19, our regional transit system was funded through a mix of fares and public subsidies. They were actually pretty nicely balanced if you look at these. The system generated revenues here, which is mostly fares, although there are a few other sources, represented about 40% of the regional transit operating budget. The RTA sales tax represented about 40%, and then there was a mix of other public subsidies that filled in the rest. Right now, fares are down because ridership is down. And so federal relief is filling that gap. But, and it is important to understand this, that federal relief is not forever. That federal relief is very significant and has tided us through the worst days of the pandemic. But based on current projections, the region's transit service providers expect to fully exhaust that funding sometime in 2025, leaving a baseline estimated budget gap of about $730 million in 2026. And that's a lot of money. It's about 20% of the transit system's operating budget. And it's something that is not a one-time issue. This is a gap that we expect to continue and to continue to grow over the course of the decade. And so we are now thinking about, what do we do about this looming fiscal cliff, which, if left unaddressed, would lead to really significant and, in our view, devastating impacts on the regional transit system. I do want to highlight that this number is, it's one of several scenarios. This is the baseline from the RTA's 10-year financial plan working group and the strategic plan effort that they recently adopted. But in any scenario, we expect the gap to be very significant and ongoing. And so that is, a message that I really want to highlight, is that even if you make more optimistic assumptions about costs and ridership and fares, we are still facing a large gap just because the ridership dynamics and the fare dynamics on transit have changed. Fewer people are going to work every day of the week, which leads to challenges for, transit routes that relied on the weekday commute. And we are seeing, persistent challenges in ridership recovery throughout the system. And that is leading to lower levels of fares, which we need to plan for and be able to be equipped to respond. Something that's really important to understand as well is that this is not a challenge that the transit agencies can solve on their own. An obvious first question that you might ask is, oh, well, could we cut service? Could we raise fares? And the short answer is that if we were to pursue service cuts or fare increases at the level required to close a gap of this size, we would risk starting a downward spiral of reduced ridership, which would reduce revenues, which would require more cuts. And this is not, this is not a small rounding error in the budget. This is a really large budget gap. And so the scale of cuts required to close a gap like this, because transit systems have large fixed costs, you can't just cut 20% of service to reduce the 20% of operating costs. You have to cut more, which could leave the transit system, really unrecognizable from the scale of the, what we as a region have come to rely on, to expect, and to need. Our region relies on transit, and a system where we make cuts of this scale is really not something that we as an agency, or I think I would guess many of you in this room, would really want to contemplate or to be okay with. And so that's why we were having these discussions and why we were talking about these, because we know that transit is so important and we have to do what we need to support it. So I have a discussion question here, which is a more general one, and I'd welcome thoughts in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute. We are really curious for your perspective on having walked through that, what you see as the value of transit, especially to achieving the region's climate goals. We have some recommendations that we're going to walk through that have some specific impacts on that front. But before we go through that, would welcome any input or ideas on how we articulate the value of transit as a climate measure.
If you don't have any input, please feel free to use the raise your hand or stack button so we can make sure we're ordered this conversation.
And if not, we have more discussion questions later on, but just wanted to offer that. Laura.
Yeah, hi. I'm actually a Metro rider, but I've noticed that they're changing their schedules a bit, which is great. But a lot of times on weekends, if you're coming back from some event, they're about every hour apart. Sometimes it makes it so late that I drive because I don't want to be out, getting home at 11:45. It would seem like there should be more flexibility in some of the schedules, because people are on these trains, but they're not maybe going down for work, but they're going down for other events. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great observation, and something we can get into in a bit more later on. Something that Metra is seeing, and this is more generally for all of the transit agencies, is that of all of the ridership markets, weekend and special event service, those trips, they've seen greater recovery. People are returning to those in higher numbers. They are still a relatively small portion of the ridership, so it's important to understand how they fit within the overall transit ecosystem. But that is a market that's actually returned, that people, you can see some Lollapalooza shows up really clearly on ridership charts, which I think is a funny note. There's a defined spike on the weekend of that event. And so that is certainly an area where there are opportunities for more service and more, more and better frequent transit options. So we do see some opportunities there, and we can talk about them a bit more. Thank you for raising that. I also see a comment in the chat from Alan about how public transit improves not only air quality and decreased carbon emissions, but also improves quality of life by being able to not focus on driving while commuting. And it saves money spent on gas. I would agree with all of those. And I appreciate you highlighting the air quality component, because that is another really important one. There's many emissions beyond just CO2, and they do have a really significant impact on regional quality of life. I see Deb has her hand up.
Hi, I just finished a climate reality leadership training, and from the Climate Reality Project in Al Gore, it's really clear that mass transit is a huge component of how we need to meet our climate goals if we're going to turn this around at all. And there's also a significant amount of funding coming that's available through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I'm curious, very interested in learning how we are accessing those funds, what CMAP is doing to access those funds.
It's a good question. So some of these programs, are programs that we either administer or have some role in allocating, and we've been convening regional stakeholders, transportation providers to coordinate on applications for a variety of infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure law grant programs. So that's one thing that we are working with partners to try to. We've developed a priority project list that we are using to help to advance those conversations with the federal congressional delegation and with DOT. I think some of the newer programs, I am not involved in the direct administration. I don't know if my colleague Kasha knows any more details about how we're setting some of them up, but I know that that's also this is an area where we have some existing programs like the congestion mitigation and air quality program, where we do use some of that funding for transit projects. That's a really robust funder of transit capital investments here in our region. And something that we do see with those programs and with the broader and sustained increase in federal funding that has come out of these programs is the opportunity to make investments that support a more robust and reliable transit system. On the capital side, where we are trying to talk about in this work especially is to really focus on what we need for transit operations. And while I know that line is not always incredibly clear, there are sometimes things that blur it, that this is a transit operating funding crisis, and we are trying to figure out what makes sense in terms of ongoing operating support, because that is something that historically the federal government has been less involved in for large urban transit agencies. They used to, but it has, aside from COVID, it has been decades since the feds provided really robust operating support. So we are thinking about whether there could be success in pursuing that more broadly, but also thinking about how we solve this locally. I also see a number of additional questions in the chat. Certainly, John Anderson points out that business commutes have shifted. We are certainly seeing that, and he asks about if we have updated projections long-term and how we're designing the system. I'll just point out a couple of things that we've seen. One is that Metra has been reporting that, for the most part, their riders have returned. They've just returned 2 or 3 days a week, not 5 days a week. And so that does indicate that there are changes in travel patterns, and that could lead us to think about different service patterns, maybe looking at Monday and Friday differently than Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But what's important to keep in mind as well is that, our assessment is that about 60% of regional jobs are in industries and occupations that have to be done in person. And so the majority of residents are working in jobs that cannot be done remotely. And the rest are working in jobs that, may be able to be done remotely, but oftentimes people are doing them in a hybrid fashion. And so we still have a lot of people traveling to and from work. And we also need, something that I try to keep in mind is that transit serves a lot more than just work trips. Even the region to downtown trips, a lot of those are for work, but a lot of those are for amenities that are in the downtown area. And so, that is something that we are keeping in mind. Certainly, understanding that we need to accommodate new and different travel demands on the system, and potentially thinking about better serving some of those trips that neither start nor end downtown could be an opportunity for the system. I see another question here from Ellen about how we are encouraging land use and parking policies that support transit use. It is a great question, and something that we do have some thoughts on coming up in the presentation. So I will, if it's okay, put a pin in that one and we talk about it when we get to it. And Kath also notes that that a world-class city does have accessibility by public transit. Definitely agree. It's an important, part of what makes Chicago and Northeastern Illinois such an attractive place to live and work. So we are using that as a basis for our argument for why it's so important to support the system. Finally, I think I'll address this last question from Alderman Martin and then move on to the next section. How do changing ridership numbers interact with Metra's potential shift away from the 9 to 5 trips? The ridership figures that we've seen are that, that daytime, the morning and evening commute trips are down relative to where they were, especially on Mondays and Fridays. And the weekend and special event trips are up relative to what they were. And certainly they've returned more than work commutes. That does present some options to think about changing what kinds of service Metra could provide. And they've talked publicly about this as part of their evolution to what they're calling a regional rail model, where you might have more frequent service throughout the day, with memorable headways. And also, something that we could think about is how we provide service, whether there's maybe opportunities for infill stations in areas of the region that, have a rail line but don't have a rail station right now. Those are opportunities that we see, there are challenges coming out of the changes in ridership demand, but also real potential benefits of thinking about using those rail assets to serve more trips to more places at more times of the day. So we do see some real opportunities there, understanding that increasing service in that way would have costs, and we have to think about how we support a more robust, more frequent transit network at a time when we are facing some significant financial challenges. Okay. Oh, yes, Alderman Martin.
Oh no, you're totally okay. HONORE.
So I'm going to move on to the next section. Thank you all for those questions and comments. They are really helpful. So we're here today because the state of Illinois has deemed it so. In Public Act 102-1028, if you have an interest in going and finding the relevant page on the Illinois General Assembly website, the state required that CMAP develop a plan that we have called the Plan of Action for Regional Transit to address the looming challenges facing the transit system. So Our mandate, and this text is basically just copied from the statute, is to look at the long-term financial viability of the system, but not just to think about the finances. We need to think about its ability to be comprehensive and coordinated, whether it's safe, secure, clean, efficient, and to Ellen's comment earlier, whether it supports and fosters efficient land use. We also are required to consider dimensions like racial equity, climate change, economic development, and the RTA strategic plan, which provides a really strong foundation for this work. And then by law, we have to look at a number of dimensions, some of them quite specific. The fare box recovery ratio, which is the required amount that the system generates from fares, as well as things like sales taxes, how they are gathered, how they are distributed, the governance of the transit system, fares, how that works across the region, and then anything else, anything related to the legislation, policy, rules, or funding of the transit system, especially within the Regional Transportation Authority Act. So by law, we have also created a steering committee of regional stakeholders that are helping us guide the development of this report. And so, among others, Jen Walling from the Illinois Environmental Council is serving on that steering committee, but it is a mix, as required by statute, of business, civic, labor, community, and environmental stakeholders. So they have been meeting with us regularly. We have a series of public large group meetings of that steering committee that are going in advance of the final report later this year. We're also working closely with stakeholders and partners throughout the region. There's a lot of these. We're having a lot of conversations and presentations like this one, thinking about both public and nonprofit and private sector stakeholders from groups like this, environmental groups, media, academia, municipal leadership, and a whole range. We're having a lot of discussions. And all of this is feeding into a process where, by law, the report is due January 1st of next year. So we started our steering committee process earlier this year. We have been working on developing recommendations through the last few months, and we are planning to continue that work in advance of the statutorily required approval of this report by our MPO policy committee, as well as CMAP's board in October of 2023. And so that's the plan and where we are moving. I see a comment in the chat about electrification that I will get to in just a moment. Before we go into the specifics, I do want to highlight some of the principles that we have kept front of mind as we're developing these recommendations. One is that we don't want to just solve this in 2026. We want to think about how we ensure the system is financially viable on an ongoing basis, that we solve some of this structurally. Because this is a report to the General Assembly, we are really focusing on areas where the state has or could have a significant role in implementing solutions. We also know that while our transit system had a lot of good qualities before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were also areas where there were challenges. There were some long-term issues that we as an agency have been highlighting and that the transit service providers have been working on. And we want to rebuild to a system that is better than the one that we had before COVID-19, one that centers the users of the system as we think about where we should go with those challenges. And then, as we've been directed and as some of the legislators involved in this process have told us at the kickoff of this, that we should be bold, that we are facing really significant challenges and we shouldn't be afraid to propose ambitious solutions. So we've divided the three areas of this, or we've divided this project into three areas. One is what we've called the system we want, thinking about how we can rebuild public confidence in the system and ensure that travelers can seamlessly and affordably access opportunities throughout the region. So this is sort of, what are we rebuilding to? What is the better system that we want coming out of COVID? We're also thinking about how we're going to pay for it. As I shared, we have a large budget gap that we are facing. So we want to think about how we can close that budget shortfall and pay for improvements. So not just to get back to what we had, but to get to something better. Thinking about how we can do that through both reforms and new funding. And then finally, we need to think about some of the implementation concerns. The governance and funding allocation is required by statute that we address, and how that interacts with the system that we want and that we are paying for. So thinking about what kinds of changes to governance and to funding allocation are consistent with those transit system goals. So that's the high level structure. I have some slides next that have a lot of text. So I'm going to walk through them, but it's really showing where we think we could be going with some of these recommendations. And then we have some discussion questions for your perspective on these or other topics. So the system that we want has a number of things that we are thinking about. And this is really building on the work that CMAP and regional partners have been doing on these topics in recent years. One area of focus for us is better buses. We are thinking about how we can make the bus system faster, more frequent, and more reliable through things like bus priority infrastructure, thinking about automated camera enforcement of bus lanes and bus stop violations. This is building on a pilot that the city of Chicago is currently doing or has passed legislation to support, not yet in place, as well as public sector staff capacity at roadway agencies, both for IDOT and for municipal and county roadway departments. We're also thinking about making the system accessible, thinking about physical accessibility, but also technological and accessibility for all kinds of abilities, beyond just wheelchairs, thinking about auditory and visual disabilities and how we support travelers from all backgrounds. As some chatter in the comments has noted, within operational efficiencies, we are thinking about how we can adjust service in response to new travel patterns, maybe supporting some off-peak travel in ways that we haven't before, and also what sorts of supports the state could provide in terms of bus electrification, ensuring that we are doing this, but not doing it in a way that leaves the system with less resources and with less service than it has today. We're also thinking about safety, security, and cleanliness on the system, whether that's supporting things like transit ambassadors or increased staff presence within the transit stations and vehicles, as well as supporting and reinforcing the work that is happening by RTA and the service boards today, since we're aware that we are submitting recommendations next year for a problem that is currently happening. I also want to just respond to something in the chat, which is that we are talking here about bus electrification within operational efficiencies. There is a component of regional rail discussions, which is on this slide, which is the evolution of Metra to support more all-day frequent travel. That could involve discussions around what kinds of vehicles Metra is using. And one of the questions there is propulsion systems. So are you using electricity? And so that is up for discussion and something that we will be exploring. It's also a topic that I believe Metra is thinking about as part of their some ongoing planning work that they have begun on the redesign, or it's a network system plan that they are currently starting to develop. Other things to highlight here, talking about integrated and affordable fares, thinking about how you can transfer between the systems, whether there are opportunities for subsidies for travelers with limited incomes. As I mentioned, regional rail, thinking about supporting that shift toward more frequent all-day service. And then to Ellen's question earlier, thinking about what sorts of opportunities there are for transit supportive land use and development. Some of this is thinking about, what do we do? How could we better use assets like parking lots in proximity to metro stations or to PACE facilities or to CTA facilities? But we're also thinking about what sorts of state regulations or incentives could be deployed to better support transit supportive employment locations, transit supportive residential developments. Those are the sorts of things that we do think could fit in here. And I see that there is another question in the chat from Ellen about automated enforcement, about the measures of success. I think that's something that we would need to define, and it's certainly something that I believe the city of Chicago is looking at in its Smart Streets pilot project. I think that one of the primary ways that we would measure the success is whether or not we are successful in speeding up buses within the facility. And so that would be I think a big component of it. Something that we are thinking about as part of any program design is, what you do with the revenue from such a program. And, one way that you could focus on that revenue is paying for the cost of the program, but also potentially, if you have additional funding generated, pay for bus priority improvements, that you're taking that revenue and investing it in the system, and then thinking about whether there are income-based considerations about fine structures. The city of Chicago, again, has some models that we could look at deploying more widely if you were to do this at regional scale. And I think that is something you would need to look at and see how it's going and continue to ensure that it is achieving its goals. And if not, consider how you might change it. To keep moving, and then again, we'll pause for discussion. We are also looking at how we pay for this. These things are not free, and we are facing a budget gap. And so we're thinking about a mix of options. We're thinking about new or modified public revenues, whether that's changes to the sales tax within the broader universe of transit funding. You could broaden the sales tax base to cover more services. Right now, we have a relatively narrow sales tax base, as well as thinking about the overall rate levels. We're also looking at revenues from the road system. We know that transit is an integral part of the transportation system, and so there might be opportunities to use transportation dollars for transportation problems to support transit. We're also looking at what the state could do, and thinking about a broader range of potential revenue ideas. Things that have been brought up include utility tax or income taxes, but there are a range of options, and we're looking at what our peers in the US and across the globe use to fund their transit systems. We're also looking at what the system can do, and whether that might be thinking about pairing the ideas around income-based fare subsidies with fare increases for the system as a whole, and whether there are ways that we can maximize other opportunities like concessions or advertising. We don't think that those are enormous, but they are there, and we can think about how we make the most of them. We're also looking at the operational and structural savings that we might be able to pursue, whether we can quantify the costs or the savings from some of our system improvements. Things like bus priority can save you money because you can speed up your buses. You can run service with fewer operators. And we're also thinking about what other potential savings we could pursue, either operationally or structurally. As required by the law, we're also looking here about what we do about the fare box recovery ratio requirement, and then thinking again about what the federal government could do to support us. I do want to again reemphasize that we are not counting on the federal government to save us on this front. We know that they have provided a really tremendous amount of support during the COVID-19 pandemic. But for that support, we would be having a very different conversation today. But while we will continue to advocate for additional federal support on these topics, we are not counting on it. We believe the consequences of failure are too dramatic, and we have to identify ways that we can address this ourselves without federal support if it fails to materialize. Finally, we have a series of topics that we are exploring on governance and funding distribution, thinking about how we allocate the existing and potential new public subsidy funds. So how sales taxes flow, how things like the real estate transfer tax flow, how new funding might flow. We're thinking about questions of system governance and decision-making, thinking about what kinds of roles fit where within the broader universe of transit in the region, and thinking about how our transit system governance is reflective of the policy ideas that we're advancing elsewhere in this project. So one example here, fare integration has some system user impacts, but it also has impacts on funding, and it also has impacts on governance. You have to figure out who makes these decisions, how they are made on an ongoing basis. Similarly, I think this would come up in questions around bus electrification, that these are decisions that are made by different agencies that have impacts, and then we need to think about how they fit within the broader system. And then again, because there's governance implications, we're also thinking in this group, or in this topic area, about the fare box recovery ratio, and what are the performance metrics that make the most sense for our system. We know that we are unlikely to return to 50% fare box recovery in the near or medium or even maybe long term. But what does make sense as a metric for how we measure success and how we encourage the system to continue to perform in the ways that we want it to? So I know that that was a wall of content. We have a number of discussion questions that my colleague can also put in the chat. But really, I'd be curious for your reactions to those as a suite of ideas. And also thinking about, some questions that we've outlined here, which strategies you think would be the most effective in enabling or encouraging our regional residents to use more environmentally sustainable transportation options like transit. Also thinking about, the fact that some of these strategies have environmental benefits. I think I've seen some chat or some conversation in the chat about, congestion pricing and car pricing. Those are things that not only could fund transit, but also have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. Others, like sales taxes, could fund transit, don't have much of a connection to greenhouse gas emissions. And so thinking about which of those you find most compelling and how we develop a package that is most successful. And then more broadly, any ideas on how we incorporate transit into climate advocacy and really drawing the connection, the importance of what transit is and what transit means to a regional response to climate change. So with that, again, would welcome any thoughts or comments. I know there's a few already in the chat that we can respond to, but if anyone wants to come off mute, I would welcome a discussion. Kate.
Hi, thanks for this great presentation. I really appreciate that the study includes what we want as well as how to get there. I just wanted to kind of synthesize both my comment and Mary's, which is a big part of the transit puzzle is car use. We know that I put in a link to a great article. Many of you may already have seen it about how important we have to grapple with how underpriced car use is. But I also wondered what consideration is CMAP incorporating to reflect that some people really do have limited options versus car use. So how do we walk that tightrope of recognizing that low-income households might be priced out of transit-rich neighborhoods, but we want to change the playing field so that transit is a viable and competitive mode for more of the region. And how does that relate to some of the capacity expansion CMAP has done and the missed opportunity to flex funds that Mary has brought to our attention?
I will respond in a few different ways because it's a complicated question. Certainly, as we are thinking about any of these policy ideas, one of the primary lenses that we are using to evaluate them is understanding their impact on more vulnerable communities. And so that is a big part of our analysis and something that we're thinking about quite a lot. And to your specific question on road fees and how that plays into the equity of the system, something that we can look to is within our region, the Illinois Tollway has developed a system that they call iPass Assist, that is an income-based assistance program that they've also tried to make, I think, easier than some of these systems to sign up for and to verify eligibility. So that's a model that we could look to. Thinking about how that could fit into a broader response. I think it's a similar philosophy to what we're thinking about with, maybe pairing fare in the discussion around maintaining fares with inflation, but also thinking about low-income fare subsidies. So that I think there are ways that these can echo each other throughout the policy development. It is good to highlight the degree to which we are talking about transit recommendations, but transit fits within the broader transportation system. And understanding, the dynamic between car use and transit use is very, very important. That a lot of these, we're going to think about ways to encourage transit use, we also have to think about what car options are available and that, but also thinking about if we want to discourage single occupancy vehicle use, making sure that we have transit options available. And so those are both important. The discussion around flexing of federal funding is certainly something that we are thinking about and could fit into this. There are already ways in which our region flexes some federal dollars toward transit, especially through the CMAP program, but that there could be additional opportunities, and that is something that we'll be discussing as part of the broader menu of options. There are a lot of options, they all have challenges, but that is certainly something we are contemplating. And I see, just to sort of read out Mary's comment from the chat, that there are opportunities legally to flex funding from the Federal Highway Administration toward transit. And so that is just to make sure that that's something that people are aware of, that it is something that we do to some extent, but not a great deal here in Illinois. And I also see that Alan left a comment about how things like gas taxes, parking, downtown cordon are all opportunities to fund transit. They are certainly things that we are thinking about, and they are, as you say, like in London or New York City is another place that is in the process of deploying a Manhattan cordon charge that they are going to use to fund transit, that there are precedents for these kinds of systems, although they come with their own challenges. And certainly some of them can be done on different timelines than others. I see that Alderman Martin has left a chat about longer term emphasis on density near transit is key, especially, including in the suburban areas of our region. We are certainly thinking about the land use and transit nexus as part of this report. We do see opportunities for recommendations on that area. In all parts of our region, something that I think that we benefit from as a region is our really robust rail network that extends throughout the region, and we do have little clusters of development, downtown nodes in communities throughout the region, but there are opportunities to think about how those areas can continue to be transit supportive. Sort of the shorthand way that I've been thinking about this is that if ridership has declined by some proportion, that we're going to be able to continue to support the system, we have to think about increasing the pool of potential riders within proximity to those stations. And I see there's a couple of articles posted. Thank you for sharing resources like that. Putting an effective US price on carbon can support transfer of funding to environmentally friendly transit. What's our position and engagement on this issue? We have talked about various carbon mechanisms, offsets, as one potential thing on the menu of options. We are exploring a whole range of things. Appreciate the suggestion. It is certainly one that has a very close nexus with the topics that we've talked about today and with the climate angle specifically. And it is one that we've looked at how other places have used these. I know that there are some systems that generate some revenue from carbon offsets. So that is an idea that we have thought about, but we're going to have to do some more analysis to figure out the opportunities and potential here in the region. And I see another question in the chat, or more, I guess more of a comment about transit is seen as not permanent and can be taken away at a moment's notice. And thinking about how we can ensure that we have people can continue to rely on transit. I think that's a good observation. It is a challenge, and it's a challenge for rail service and especially for bus service. I think we have not really explored the idea of putting something like that in a constitutional guarantee, but we are thinking about what, as we talk about what is the system that we want, how do we tell the story of the service that we want? The transit is not just about having the assets, it's about having service, that ultimately a rail line is only as good as the service that it provides. And so that may be part of our discussion more broadly about the governance of the system and what the goals that we are setting. If we're thinking about the fare box recovery ratio as the old performance metric for the system, that one way of thinking about other changes is to think about, so what are the service that we want? And that could be a way that we evaluate the system. We are still talking through that and thinking through what it could entail, but that is one way that we could move more toward that goal. Kate, I see you also asked about BRT in the plan. We are definitely focusing on bus priority, both dedicated lanes and other investments like TSP or Q jumps, or as part of this. We see during the pandemic, bus ridership was much more resilient than the rest of transit, and that really emphasized to us, the important role that buses play in serving all kinds of trips, especially for lower income, more vulnerable communities. And so we see this as a real opportunity to focus on buses, speeding them up, making them more reliable, making them more frequent. So BRT is not all of that, but it is one very important component to that. And thinking about what sorts of things we could do as a region to plan for, fund, and implement bus priority in a way that really makes our bus system faster, more frequent, and more reliable. I'm happy to keep reading questions off. I'd also, if anyone has anything they'd like to come off mute and say, would welcome that too. Certainly, Mary Buchanan notes that the most effective way of getting regional residents to use transit and other options, sustainable options, is to make them competitive with cars, principally. We are certainly thinking about how we can do that and to make transit, stable and continued robust option. One of the challenges of the current funding system for transit is that so much of it relies on sales tax, which is a cyclical revenue source. And it also relies on fares, which can be cyclical as well. And certainly with COVID-19, it's demonstrated that they are not always and forever fixed. And so we are thinking about that as one element of assessing, how useful a different revenue source is whether it can make it more sustainable and recession-proof, as you say. I don't know how much we can plan in terms of pandemic proofing, but it is something we are thinking about, the stability of our regional transit funding mechanisms. Yes, Mary?
Yeah, just to respond to that, I think the key to recession-proof or pandemic-proof is the variety of funding sources, as you mentioned. So not putting all of our eggs or too many of our eggs in any one basket, kind of having a diverse profile of funding sources hopefully protects the system, barring future events that we can't predict.
Yeah, certainly it is a good point, and something we talk a lot at CMAP about resiliency, sort of on the environmental and weather perspective, but there's also an important aspect of sort of financial resiliency. And even if we don't know what the next crisis will be, having a more diversified set of revenue sources is likely to leave us better equipped to handle it. Even within, we talked about our sales tax as a big funding source. Even the idea of broadening that to include more services instead of focusing so narrowly on goods is itself a way of diversifying that as a revenue source, because you at least have a broader pool of items that are potentially being applied to, items or services that it's being applied to. I do also see a comment in here about private corporate involvement. We definitely see that as a potential area of work. I know I covered a lot of ground. We are thinking about what kinds of transportation demand management strategies could be pursued and looking to what other places have done in terms of corporate or private sector responsibility. Some of the things that we have seen in other places are either requirements or incentives for employers to reduce the share of their workforce that is commuting by single occupancy vehicle. Also, promoting the use of pre-tax transit benefits. And I do see the mention of the private shuttles. That is a topic that's come up a little bit as well. We don't have quite the same scale of them as maybe somewhere like the Bay Area does, but we do have a robust network of downtown shuttles, as well as examples of private shuttles in places like Lake County, the Shuttlebug that provided transport to and from metro stations and suburban office districts. So there is a potential role there, and we're thinking about what the state could do on that front. I see another question here about BRT and whether there's an approach to a coordinated BRT approach. And that's a very good question, and something that we are thinking about how we plan for regional bus priority. That is one element of this that we are looking to develop is, identifying what regional focuses are for bus priority, whether it's dedicated lanes or some other kind of investment. And so that is definitely, as CMAP is a regional entity, we try to think regionally, and it's top of mind for us. And we do know that, while many people's travel does stay within their jurisdiction, like most people do not plan their lives or their days around municipal, township, or county borders. And yet we have transportation systems that are in many cases defined around those borders. So we're trying to bring a broader regional perspective on things like bus priority to make sure that we are addressing what is truly a regional travel need. It's not a specific jurisdiction. Laura highlights that there are good benchmarks to look at elsewhere, and I would agree. We are looking at a variety of opportunities and really trying to learn from our peers and from not only in the US, but also globally, since we know there's a lot that we could learn from and benefit from in terms of how other places have succeeded on many of these same challenges. Ellen Partridge notes that safety is also a really big concern. That's something that CMAP has taken a really special interest in as of late, and you may or may not be aware, or the attendees may not be aware that we recently were awarded a federal grant through the Safe Streets for All program to do regional safety planning for 6 of the 7 counties in our service area. And so that is something that we are focusing on. It's not going to be as much within this project, although we do recognize that there are strong connections between the use of transit and the ability for people to get to and from the transit system, often by walking or biking. And so we are going to continue to identify, areas where we could make a difference, and those regional safety action plans are also going to be highlighting opportunities for that at a regional scale. I see that Audrey has left a note about a pending piece of legislation about requirements on offering pre-tax transit benefits. That is also something that we'll be watching closely. Thank you, Audrey. And some questions here about, I think 2 related questions here about, people moving into and across within the region, and, the possibilities of people leaving the region. We do monitor ongoing population trends within the region. We do long-range population forecasting, both at a regional scale and at a sub-regional, municipal and local scale. So we do factor that into our long-term planning. It's included in our travel modeling. We do know that as a region, we have a lower level of population growth than many of our peer regions, and that does have an impact on the amount of development and tax base and revenue that is coming into regional governments and sort of the entire regional economy. We continue to see real opportunities for investment in transportation solutions, and see a future that has much more robust usage and support for transit. Sort of even if our population growth remains at lower levels than in other places. When we last looked at the census results on these figures, I will note that, while the state did see lower growth, or I guess a little bit of a decline, depending on which vintage of census you're looking at, the region, the Northeastern Illinois region, saw less of that we were more stable, and that the state as a whole had more of that. So we are monitoring that. We are sort of, whatever our population future, we continue to think that transit is going to be a critical part of our overall regional transportation system. So we are working accordingly. And I know we are running up on 1 o'clock. Danny, if you need to cut me off, let me know. I see that there is one last question here about how we're communicating with peers across the US and the globe. Something that I will say is, we're trying to benchmark what other places have done on a range of these things. So some of that is through conversations with transit agencies or with regional government agencies or peers in the US. And so whether that's looking at automated camera enforcement in New York City, or thinking about how governance works in London, or how funding is done in Seattle, we are doing a mix of research and conversations, and looking at reports and best practices. So we are really trying to cast a wide net and to learn from what others have done, but also, knowing that many of these topics we have looked at here in the region in the past, and we have ideas and solutions that people have worked through, and that we are trying to now, use this opportunity to think about what is it that we can do, what is realistic, but also what meets the moment. We're facing some big challenges, and we have the encouragement and legislative mandate to propose some big solutions. So we are trying to keep all of that in mind as we pull together our recommendations.
Definitely. Daniel, once again, thank you so much for leading such great discussion. And obviously, this is something that many of you are thinking about and really well aware of the issue of transit advocacy. And this is just part of the beginning conversation that we're having with CMAP on this plan of action for regional transit. We are engaging in the steering committee, making sure that we are bringing these ideas. And as the plan of action continues to evolve, we'll continue updating our IC affiliates, bringing you up to speed. Because more importantly, these are recommendations that we are going to need political capital. We are going to need the advocacy of everyone in this call to make sure that we are winning and moving forward. And this was one part of the intention of this conversation, is bringing this to such a powerful group of affiliates, advocates who do work on advancing policies. And as we learn more about these recommendations and the roadmap forward, we are going to need all y'all to help us move those pieces forward. So if y'all have any questions, additional questions for Daniel, he dropped his email in the chat, but if not, we will keep you updated on the next Lunch and Learn with CMAP once the recommendations start to evolve a little bit deeper.
Thank you all. We really appreciate all the comments.
Thank you all. Hope y'all have a great rest of your afternoon.